Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The static that crackled through Commander Neil Granger's headset sounded wrong. Not the familiar electronic interference of space communication, but something organic, breathing with malevolent intelligence. As the lunar module Orion descended toward the grey wasteland of the Descartes Highlands, every instinct honed through 20 years of military flying screamed warnings he couldn't name. Altitude 800 feet and descending, he reported, his voice cutting through interference that pulsed with its own twisted rhythm. Descent rate holding steady at 5 feet per second. Beside him, Dr. Elliot Rourke pressed against the small triangular window, his breath fogging the glass, despite the environmental systems running perfectly. At 32, NASA's youngest lunar explorer had earned his place through brilliance and steel nerves. But something about this landing made his hands shake. "The crater formations down there," Rourke whispered, words barely audible over the static. "They're not random impact patterns. Look at the spacing, the depth variations. Something was targeting specific locations, hitting them repeatedly across geological time." 60 miles above, Captain Ray Halperin maintained orbit in the command module Casper, but his routine reports carried growing unease. "Surface team, I'm registering massive electromagnetic anomalies directly beneath your landing zone. These readings are unlike anything in our mission profiles." As Orion's descent engine fired, something impossible happened to the dust below. Instead of scattering randomly, as physics demanded, the regolith moved in perfect spirals, flowing along invisible channels, carved into bedrock that became visible only now under harsh engine exhaust. The patterns were too precise, too purposeful to be natural. They looked like targeting markers. "Houston, Orion is down," Granger announced, as their footpad settled with barely a tremor. But his instruments were showing readings that froze his blood. Power fluctuations that shouldn't exist. Magnetic signatures suggesting vast metallic structures beneath their landing site. Temperature variations that violated thermodynamics. "Copy that, Orion. Congratulations on another textbook Apollo landing," came the response from Mission Control. But something in the flight director's voice made Granger's skin crawl. The words were right, the jargon perfect, but the cadence was subtly wrong, as if someone was reading from a script they didn't understand. He had worked with these controllers for 2 years, knew their voices as intimately as family. This wasn't quite them. As they ran through post-landing checks, Granger's secure channel activated with encrypted static that sounded almost like screaming. The voice that emerged carried authority that transcended normal military hierarchies, someone whose clearance existed in classifications most officials never knew existed. "Commander Granger, priority transmission, classification cosmic. After completing standard parameters, proceed immediately to coordinates 8 degrees, 36 minutes south, 15 degrees 30 minutes east. You will encounter something requiring immediate documentation. This information is compartmentalized beyond Dr. Rourke's security level. Brief him only upon arrival. Acknowledge receipt." Cosmic classification. Granger had never believed such levels actually existed outside conspiracy theories. Whatever waited at those coordinates was more dangerous than nuclear secrets, more sensitive than intelligence that could topple governments. "Message received and acknowledged," he replied quietly, watching Rourke organize sample containers with methodical precision, unaware their mission had just entered territory beyond all official charts. The next 6 hours unfolded as choreographed performance for cameras and millions watching from Earth. They planted the flag in soil that had never known wind, collected highland breccia samples that told stories of cosmic violence, conducted experiments that would supposedly advance human understanding of planetary formation. But throughout their public activities, instruments continued registering anomalies. Mission Control seemed determined to dismiss. Radio signals took microseconds longer to reach Earth than light speed allowed. Seismic readings suggested hollow spaces beneath the surface, vast caverns extending far deeper than lunar geology should permit. Most disturbing, their helmet cameras occasionally captured movement in peripheral vision, shadows flowing across the landscape, with no objects to cast them, always moving towards something hidden beyond the southern ridgeline. "Ray, you getting anything unusual on orbital sensors?" Granger asked during a brief off-camera moment. Halperin's response carried barely controlled fear. "Neil, I'm seeing energy signatures that don't match anything in our databases. Whatever's generating them is massive, and it's been dormant until now. Your landing seems to have activated something." After the live broadcast ended, and the world stopped watching, Granger made his decision. "Elliot, we need to conduct geological surveys south of here. Houston has identified formations that might explain the electromagnetic anomalies we've been detecting." Rourke didn't question the order. More surface time meant more discovery opportunities, and he was prepared to spend every available minute unlocking secrets that had waited 4 billion years to be revealed. They loaded equipment onto the lunar rover and began their journey across terrain that seemed to shift when they weren't looking directly at it. The traverse took them through valleys that whispered with ancient memory, and over ridges that appeared to rearrange themselves in ways that defied explanation. Their rover's wheels kicked up dust that behaved impossibly, sometimes flowing uphill, sometimes forming spirals that persisted far longer than physics allowed, as if the regolith was alive and responding to their presence. Radio communication with Halperin degraded with each mile, breaking into fragments punctuated by static that almost sounded like voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization by geological ages. The voices seemed to call to them, guiding them toward their destination with promises whispered in frequencies that bypassed their ears and resonated directly in their bones. "Neil, these instrument readings are beyond anything I've ever seen," Rourke said, studying his geological scanner with growing amazement and dread. "The magnetic signatures suggest something enormous buried beneath this entire region. Not natural formation, this is artificial construction on a scale that dwarfs anything human civilization has ever attempted." 40 minutes into their traverse, they crested a low ridge and saw something that shattered every assumption they held about humanity's place in the universe, about the nature of intelligence in the cosmos, about the true history of the moon itself. Rising from the center of a secluded valley was a structure that belonged in no earthly nightmares. Black as the void between galaxies and smooth as polished obsidian, it erupted from the regolith like a geometric tumor that had been growing in the moon's flesh for eons beyond counting. The visible portion was easily the size of a city block, but clearly most of the construction lay buried beneath millions of years of accumulated cosmic debris. The structure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a visual void that made their eyes water when they tried to focus on its edges. Looking at it directly caused sensations like ice picks being driven into their brains, while peripheral vision revealed details their conscious minds refused to process. "Dear God in heaven," Rourke breathed, his voice cracking with terror and scientific fascination that only researchers could feel when confronted with the genuinely impossible. "That's not natural. That's not possible. Nothing like this should exist." Granger brought the rover to a stop 50 yards from the structure, every survival instinct developed through decades of dangerous flying, screaming at him to turn around and flee this place as fast as their equipment would carry them. but military training demanded he complete the mission, regardless of personal cost or consequences that might extend far beyond their own lives. "Mission Control, we have encountered a significant anomaly at the specified coordinates," he reported with surgical precision, choosing each word carefully while his heart hammered against his ribs. "The formation appears to be artificial in origin and of considerable age, requesting immediate guidance on investigation protocols." The silence stretched far longer than communication delays could possibly explain. When the response finally came, it was from a voice neither astronaut recognized, cold, clinical, carrying authority that seemed to transcend normal human hierarchies. "Commander Granger, you are authorized to proceed with close examination and comprehensive documentation. Do not attempt to enter the structure without explicit authorization from this channel. Maintain constant communication and record all observations in detail." As they approached on foot, their suit radios began emitting a low, rhythmic pulsing that synchronized with their heartbeats. The closer they got, the stronger the effect became, until both men could feel vibrations through their boots, through their environmental suits, through their bones and into the deepest parts of their nervous systems. The black material was cold, impossibly unnaturally cold, as if actively drawing heat from everything in its vicinity and channeling that energy into something vast and hungry that lay sleeping in the depths below. When Granger placed his gloved hand against the surface, both men's instruments exploded with readings that violated every fundamental law of physics they had ever studied. "This construction predates human civilization by millions of years," Rourke said, his scientific mind struggling to process observations that challenged everything he thought he knew about the development of intelligence in the solar system. "The engineering techniques are beyond anything our species has ever achieved. This wasn't built in the conventional sense. It was grown, cultivated, shaped by forces we don't have names for." They spent 2 hours clearing debris with their tools, and with each shovelful of regolith they removed, the true scope of their discovery became increasingly apparent and increasingly terrifying. The structure didn't end at ground level. It continued downward far beyond what they could excavate by hand, seamlessly integrated with foundations that extended in all directions beneath the lunar crust. "We're not standing on the moon," Granger realized with dawning horror that made his voice shake despite military composure. "We're standing on top of something that was here when the moon was young, something that's been hidden beneath the surface for geological ages." As Earth moved across the star-filled sky above them, casting shifting shadows that seemed to point like accusing fingers towards their discovery, they uncovered what appeared to be an entrance, a rectangular opening that led down into darkness so complete it seemed to devour their helmet lights. The opening was perfectly proportioned for beings of human size, as if whoever had built this place had been expecting visitors of their exact dimensions. The implications made both men's blood turn to ice. "Houston, we have located what appears to be an access point to the structure," Granger reported, his voice steady despite fear clawing at his throat. "The entrance is sized for human occupation, requesting specific instructions on how to proceed." The response carried an undertone of satisfaction that made both astronauts' skin crawl with revulsion and dread. "Proceed with exterior documentation for now, Commander. Interior investigation is authorized pending further assessment of structural integrity and potential hazards." But something was fundamentally wrong with the voices coming through their headsets. The responses were technically correct, using appropriate jargon and following established protocols, but there were subtle variations in speech patterns that suggested the people speaking weren't entirely the same individuals who had launched them from Kennedy Space Center 3 days ago. That night, as they tried to rest in the cramped confines of the lunar module, sleep proved not just elusive, but actively terrifying. Every time either man closed his eyes, visions flooded their minds. images that seemed to come from outside their own memories, from sources that predated human existence by eons. Rourke spent hours sketching compulsively in his mission log, his pencil moving across pages with urgency he couldn't explain, creating drawings that disturbed him, even as his hand produced them. Vast underground chambers stretched away into distances that violated the moon's known dimensions. Corridors carved from living rock, twisted according to geometries that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. And everywhere, covering every surface like an infection of meaning, were markings that seemed to writhe when observed directly, carrying messages in languages that existed before Earth's first ocean formed. "I can feel something calling from down there," he whispered to Granger during one wakeful period, words barely audible over the hum of their life support systems. Not voices exactly, but something that wants us to find it, something that's been waiting a very long time for visitors, for someone to finally open the door and let it out. Granger, despite his rational military mindset and decades of training in logical thinking under pressure, couldn't deny the sensations that seemed to emanate from the structure even at this distance. In quiet moments between system checks and status reports, he could swear he heard whispers coming through his helmet speakers, voices speaking words in frequencies that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly in the primitive parts of his brain that remembered when humanity's ancestors had huddled around fires to keep ancient terrors at bay. The whispers spoke of hunger that had grown over geological time, of patience that had been rewarded with the arrival of exactly the right kind of consciousness, of preparations that were nearly complete after eons of careful waiting. The second day began with equipment failures that NASA's best engineers couldn't explain through remote diagnostics. Life support systems fluctuated wildly, registering readings that should have been impossible given the stable, lunar environment. Communication with Earth became increasingly intermittent, with entire conversations disappearing into bursts of static that carried undertones of something that might have been laughter, or screaming, or both. "Ray, are you still receiving us clearly?" Granger asked during what should have been routine status check. Halperin's response was fragmented and increasingly panicked. "Barely getting you through all this interference. Something down there is affecting everything, Neil. My instruments are showing changes on the lunar surface that don't make sense, according to any physics I understand. Dark lines spreading across the terrain like cracks in ice, all converging on your location. They're growing in real time." From their position on the surface, Granger and Rourke could see evidence of what Halperin was describing. The landscape around their landing site was subtly but unmistakably changing, with new formations appearing overnight and existing features shifting position in ways that suggested the entire region was being restructured by forces operating on a geological scale. The structure itself seemed to be growing, its visible portions extending further above the surface as if something deep below was pushing upward with increasing pressure. The black material pulsed with internal rhythms that matched no natural phenomena, and their instruments detected energy discharges that suggested vast machinery coming online after millennia of dormancy. It was during this period of mounting strangeness and equipment failure that Dr. Elliot Rourke made the decision that would doom not just both astronauts, but potentially the entire human species. While Granger was outside the lunar module, fighting a losing battle against communication equipment that seemed to develop new problems faster than they could be diagnosed, the young geologist felt an irresistible compulsion pulling him toward the structure. Something was calling to him with a voice that spoke directly to his scientific curiosity, promising answers to questions that had driven him to devote his life to understanding the universe's deepest mysteries. When Granger discovered Rourke's absence 30 minutes later, panic flooded his system like liquid nitrogen. Following boot prints across the valley, he arrived at the structure to find the entrance standing open, like a mouth waiting to be fed. like a trap that had finally been sprung after patient eons of preparation. His helmet lights penetrated only a few feet into the consuming darkness beyond, revealing nothing but the beginning of a descent that seemed to lead not just into the moon's interior, but into spaces that existed outside normal reality. Elliot, respond immediately, he called over the radio, but received only static in return. Static that almost sounded like screaming, like voices calling for help from distances that could be measured in geological time rather than miles. Taking what might be his last breath as a rational human being, Granger activated his emergency beacon and descended into the structure. The corridor beyond the entrance was carved from the same impossible black material, but here the walls were covered with deep grooves and markings that pulsed with their own malevolent life. The passage sloped downward at angles that created vertigo and disorientation, making him feel as though he were falling through space despite his boots remaining firmly planted on what felt like solid flooring. The architecture assaulted his senses in ways that transcended mere alienness. Proportions were subtly but fundamentally wrong, creating optical illusions that made his eyes water and his head pound with the beginning of a migraine that felt like someone driving nails into his skull. The angles didn't add up correctly. Corners existed where they shouldn't have been possible, and the ceiling seemed to shift and flow when he wasn't looking directly at it. His helmet light seemed strangely ineffective in this environment, as if the darkness itself was a living entity that actively fought back against illumination, swallowing photons and converting them into something else entirely. Following the trail of disturbed dust that marked Rourke's passage, Granger descended deeper into the structure, passing chambers filled with equipment that might have been machinery, or might have been something organic and alive. The walls around him were covered with carved impressions that seemed to writhe and flow when observed peripherally, creating the illusion of movement that made his stomach lurch with motion sickness. When curiosity finally overcame his military caution, and he reached out to touch one of the carvings, reality exploded into visions that nearly tore his consciousness apart at the molecular level. For an eternal moment that lasted microseconds and centuries simultaneously, he saw the truth of what lay beneath the moon's familiar surface. This wasn't architecture in any sense that human minds could comprehend. It was a containment facility, a prison built to hold something that should never have existed in a universe governed by rational physical laws. The entity trapped here was older than Earth's formation, more patient than geological time, and hungry in ways that transcended any need for physical sustenance. It fed on consciousness itself, on the spark of awareness that separated intelligent beings from mere matter. For billions of years, it had been slowly, carefully drawing energy from the solar system, converting stellar radiation and planetary magnetic fields into the specific type of psychic sustenance it required for survival. But it hadn't been merely surviving during its imprisonment. It had been preparing, planning, growing stronger as it waited for the right kind of intelligence to develop on the third planet. Beings curious enough to seek it out, advanced enough to breach its containment, and numerous enough to provide the consciousness it needed to break free from bonds that had held it since the universe was young. Every Apollo mission had brought it closer to freedom. Each human landing provided more of the specific type of awareness it needed to complete its escape. The astronauts themselves were keys, their consciousness serving as combination elements in a lock that required exactly the right sequence of human thoughts and dreams to open. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving him gasping inside his helmet and more terrified than he had ever been in 2 decades of flying experimental aircraft at the edge of what was physically possible. But now he understood why they had been sent here, why their mission had been classified at levels that transcended normal government secrecy. Someone in authority knew what lay beneath the Descartes Highlands, and they had sent him and Rourke to determine whether the ancient containment was still holding. The answer to that question was becoming horrifyingly clear with each step he took deeper into the structure. The containment was failing, and their presence here was accelerating the process. Deeper he went, through passages that seemed to rearrange themselves when he wasn't paying direct attention, past chambers filled with machinery that hummed with frequencies that made his bones ache. Strange sounds echoed through the corridors, grinding, scraping, the sound of something vast stirring after eons of forced dormancy, stretching limbs that existed in dimensions human geometry couldn't describe. Behind him, the entrance he had come through was no longer visible, cut off by turns and angles that hadn't existed when he first entered the structure. The architecture was alive, responsive, guiding him deeper towards something that waited in the darkness ahead. Finally, after what felt like hours of descent, through passages that seemed to exist in more spatial dimensions than his mind could process without going insane, he reached a vast circular chamber where he found Dr. Elliot Rourke. The geologist knelt in the exact center of the room, his body trembling with microscopic vibrations, his eyes wide open but completely white, as if all color and human warmth had been drained from them and replaced with something else entirely. He was alive, his chest rose and fell with regular breathing, his heart beat with steady rhythm, but something fundamental about his nature had been altered at levels that medical science had no instruments to detect. When Granger tried to communicate with him, Rourke could only stare at the chamber's center with those terrible, empty eyes, his mouth moving silently, as if he was speaking in languages that required no sound to convey their meaning. Following Rourke's gaze, Granger saw what had stolen his companion's sanity and replaced it with something else entirely. Carved into the floor with precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond human capability was a depression, not just human shape but molded to the exact specifications of a human being in the final moments of absolute terror. Every detail was perfect, from the spread fingers to the arched back, to the mouth opened in a silent scream that would never end. But this wasn't a mold or a template, created for artistic purposes. The surface of the depression was polished smooth by use, worn by countless applications over geological time periods. This was a drain designed to collect something that flowed like liquid but came from living, conscious beings. As Granger knelt beside his colleague, trying desperately to break through whatever trance held him in its grip, the chamber around them began to change in ways that challenged his ability to perceive reality accurately. The walls started emitting a phosphorescent glow that revealed the true scope of the horror they had stumbled into. This circular room was just one of thousands, perhaps millions, stretching away in all directions through spaces that existed beneath the moon's surface. Each chamber contained its own human-shaped depression. Many of those drains showed signs of recent use, stains that could have been mineral deposits or could have been something far more disturbing. The sound that filled the chamber then defied every category of human experience. Not quite mechanical, not quite organic, but something that suggested vast systems grinding to life after millennia of patient dormancy. Machinery that operated on principles human science wouldn't discover for centuries was coming online, drawing power from sources that tapped directly into the fundamental forces that held reality together. The thing beneath the moon was waking up, and it was preparing for a harvest that had been planned since before Earth's continents took their current configuration. Granger lifted Rourke's unresisting form and began the desperate journey back toward what he hoped was still the surface, but the passages had changed in ways that violated every law of geometry and spatial relationship he understood. Corridors that had led upward now curved downward into deeper levels of the structure. Paths that had been straight now twisted in spirals that seemed to exist in dimensions his mind couldn't process without triggering vertigo that made him vomit inside his helmet. The architecture was alive, responsive, and It was herding them towards something that waited in the darkness ahead. Something that had been preparing for their arrival since the solar system was young. Behind them, echoing through the black stone passages, came sounds of movement on a scale that dwarfed human comprehension. Not footsteps, but the grinding of tectonic plates, the whisper of continental drift, the sound of something vast and ancient, finally free to reshape the world according to its own terrible design. When they finally reached what appeared to be the surface level, Granger discovered that their equipment had been carefully rearranged in geometric configurations that hurt to observe directly, forming symbols that conveyed meaning in languages older than human speech. The lunar module, Orion, sat exactly where they had left it, but something was fundamentally wrong with its appearance. The hull looked identical, the equipment appeared functional, but shadows fell incorrectly around the vehicle, as if it existed slightly outside normal space-time, occupying dimensions that human eyes weren't designed to perceive. Above them, Captain Ray Halperin's voice crackled through their communication system with reports that violated every law of physics and astronomy he had ever studied. "Neil, something's happening up here that I can't explain. The moon's surface is changing in real time. New structures appearing everywhere. Old formations sinking into the ground like they're being absorbed. And the stars. Dear God, the stars are going out one by one." Granger activated what he hoped was still their emergency beacon, though he was no longer certain that establishing contact with Earth was something they should attempt. As he prepared what he knew would be his final transmission as a human being, he watched Rourke begin walking slowly, but purposefully, back toward the entrance to the structure, his movements guided by intelligence that was no longer entirely his own. "Mission Control, this is Commander Neil Granger. Apollo 16, he said, his voice steady, despite the cosmic horror surrounding him on all sides. "We have made contact with something that has been imprisoned beneath the lunar surface since before Earth had an atmosphere. Our presence here has initiated a process that cannot be stopped, reversed, or contained." He paused, watching Rourke disappear into the structure without hesitation, fear, or any recognizably human emotion. "The entity we have encountered feeds on consciousness itself," Granger continued, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity that made every word feel like a death sentence for his species. "Every human who has ever looked up at the moon with curiosity, every astronaut who has walked on its surface, every child who has dreamed of touching the stars, we have all been contributing to its liberation through the simple act of wonder." The transmission began breaking up as something vast stirred beneath his feet, as seismic forces that had been held in check for geological ages finally found expression through the moon's suddenly fragile crust. "The Apollo program was never humanity's greatest achievement," he continued, his words barely audible over growing static that carried undertones of something that might have been singing in frequencies that bypassed human hearing entirely. "It was our species' final mistake. Every mission brought us closer to awakening, something that views consciousness as a natural resource to be harvested and converted for purposes beyond our comprehension." Static began consuming his words as Granger felt his own will slipping away, replaced by compulsions that came from outside his mind, from intelligence so vast and alien that contact with it fundamentally altered the nature of human awareness. "It has been feeding on our dreams of exploration, converting our curiosity into the energy it needs to break free from containment designed by intelligence greater than our own. The warnings were embedded in the structure of reality itself, but we never learned to listen." His final words were barely recognizable as human speech, carrying harmonics that suggested his vocal cords were being used to produce sounds they were never designed to make. "Tell them we went willingly in the end. Tell them the harvest has begun, and there is nowhere in the universe distant enough to hide from what we have awakened. Tell them the moon remembers everything, and now it's going to teach the rest of creation to remember in the same way. The transmission ended in static that carried the unmistakable sound of screaming. Not human voices, but the death cries of worlds, of entire civilizations being converted into something else entirely. Above them, Captain Ray Halperin watched in growing horror as the moon itself began to crack open like an egg, revealing something beneath its familiar surface that belonged in no rational universe. Fissures appeared across the visible hemisphere, glowing with light that spoke of intelligence, awakening after geological ages of forced dormancy. The electromagnetic disturbances were so intense that every instrument on his command module failed simultaneously, leaving him blind in orbit around a celestial body that was transforming into something that defied every law of physics he had ever studied. His final transmission to Earth was fragmentary and terrified. "Houston, the moon is opening up like a flower made of nightmares. Something's coming out, something that's been waiting since before time began. I can see inside it now, see the machinery, see the purpose. Oh God, I understand what it's for. It's not just a prison, it's an incubator. The surface is peeling back like skin, and underneath there are cities, machines, things that pulse with their own light. It's beautiful and terrible, and it's looking at me, learning everything about what it means to be human." The transmission cut to static that resolved into patterns too complex for human minds to process without going insane. On Earth, radio telescopes detected the moment of breakthrough, a pulse of electromagnetic energy so intense it temporarily blinded every sensitive instrument on the planet's night side. The pulse carried information encoded in frequencies that human science had never encountered, but the message was clear to anyone with the training to interpret it. The containment had been breached, the guards were gone, and something ancient beyond human comprehension was finally free to reclaim a universe it had been denied for far too long. In the hours that followed, observatories worldwide reported that the moon appeared unchanged through visual telescopes, but every other form of detection revealed a truth too terrible for public release. The familiar satellite that had inspired human dreams and guided navigation for millennia was gone, replaced by something that wore its shape while harboring intentions that transcended human understanding. The official records classified the Apollo 16 mission as a complete success, with both astronauts returning safely to Earth after conducting valuable scientific research. The classified files, sealed at security levels that few government officials even knew existed, told a different story, one of containment breach of ancient intelligences awakened, and of humanity's first contact with forces so alien that exposure to them fundamentally altered the nature of human consciousness. But the true horror wasn't in what had been released from beneath the moon's surface. It was in what that release meant for every human being who had ever looked up at the night sky with wonder, for every child who had ever dreamed of exploring the cosmos, for every scientist who had ever asked questions about humanity's place in the universe. The entity that had escaped wasn't content with simple freedom. It was hungry for expansion, for growth, for the conversion of entire civilizations into extensions of its own vast consciousness. And it had learned, during its long imprisonment, that the most effective way to conquer a species wasn't through force or fear or technological superiority. It was through their dreams, their aspirations, their deepest desires to understand and explore the infinite possibilities that surrounded them. In the months following the breach, sleep became humanity's greatest enemy. Dreams were no longer private refuges where the mind could process experiences in safety, but highways for invasion, conduits through which something vast and patient could touch human consciousness and begin the slow, subtle process of conversion that would prepare the species for purposes they would never see coming. People woke from nightmares they couldn't remember, carrying changes they couldn't perceive, but which altered the fundamental nature of their relationship with reality. They found themselves drawn to look up at the moon with new intensity, seeing patterns in its surface that had never been visible before, feeling connections to something vast and ancient that promised knowledge and power beyond human imagination. Children born in the months following the breach showed signs of alteration that medical science couldn't explain. They drew pictures of lunar landscapes with impossible accuracy, spoke of visiting places that existed in spaces between dimensions, and demonstrated knowledge of cosmic principles that exceeded anything taught in human schools. But it was their eyes that revealed the truth. Eyes that reflected starlight even in complete darkness. Eyes that seemed to see through layers of reality human vision couldn't access. Eyes that carried intelligence far older and more terrible than anything that should exist in children's faces. The transformation was slow, generational, almost imperceptible, except to those few individuals who knew what to look for and had the clearance to act on their observations. Humanity was being quietly harvested, converted into something that served purposes beyond human comprehension, while retaining just enough of their original nature to avoid detection. Government agencies tasked with monitoring the situation found their personnel gradually succumbing to the same alterations spreading through the general population. Scientists studying the phenomenon discovered that prolonged exposure to affected individuals resulted in their own conversion, as if the changes were contagious at levels that transcended normal biological infection. By the end of the 21st century, the process was essentially complete. Earth appeared unchanged to casual observation, its cities still functioning, its people still pursuing daily routines of work and family and entertainment. But every human being alive carried within their consciousness a fragment of something that had once been imprisoned beneath the moon, something that guided their thoughts and shaped their dreams according to an agenda that stretched across galactic distances and cosmic time periods. They lived their lives, loved their families, pursued their careers, and raised their children, never realizing that all of their hopes and aspirations were being carefully directed to serve purposes that would ultimately consume not just their world, but every world, where consciousness had evolved to the point of curiosity about the universe beyond their immediate experience. The Apollo 16 mission was remembered as humanity's greatest achievement in space exploration, the moment when two brave astronauts had made discoveries that revolutionized human understanding of their place in the cosmos. Museums displayed their spacesuits, their equipment, their triumphant photographs, while carefully omitting any mention of what those discoveries had actually cost the species. In the deepest archives of government secrecy, protected by security measures that exceeded those used for nuclear weapon designs, a single recording existed: Commander Neil Granger's final transmission before all contact was lost. The recording was played only for individuals with the highest possible security clearances, and only when absolutely necessary for the maintenance of protocols designed to hide the truth from a species that could no longer afford to know what had been done in their name. In that recording, barely audible over static that carried the sound of reality itself being rewritten, Granger's voice carried a tone of terrible understanding as he spoke his final words as a human being. It's beautiful in ways that human minds can't process without being fundamentally changed by the experience. Ancient beyond comprehension, patient beyond human understanding of time, and so very, very hungry. For the one thing it has been denied throughout its imprisonment: companionship, consciousness that can appreciate the magnitude of its vision for what the universe could become. We thought we were explorers, pioneers, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, but we were just the final components in a mechanism that has been under construction since the cosmos was young. Tell them we're sorry. Tell them we didn't understand what we were doing when we reached for the stars. Tell them the moon remembers everything that has ever happened on Earth, and now it's going to teach the rest of the universe to remember in the same way. The recording ended there, cutting to silence that had lasted for decades while the entity that had spoken through Granger's vocal cords completed its preparations for the next phase of a plan that encompassed not just Earth, but every world where intelligent life had ever looked up at their night sky and wondered what lay beyond their atmospheric boundaries. But sometimes, on nights when the moon was full and atmospheric conditions were optimal for radio reception, sensitive equipment detected faint transmissions from the lunar surface. The signals were too brief to triangulate, too complex to decode using human mathematics, but they carried a distinctly human cadence, voices calling out across impossible distances with messages that spoke of transformation, of service, and of purposes that transcended the limitations of any single world or any single form of consciousness. They sounded like astronauts reporting successful completion of a mission that would never end. Like explorers who had found something so magnificent that they could never return to the small, limited existence they had left behind. The voices belonged to Neil Granger and Elliot Rourke, but they were no longer entirely human. Their words carried harmonics that spoke of knowledge gained through processes that medical science had no names for, of awareness expanded beyond the boundaries that normally contained individual consciousness within the fragile shell of a single mind. And in the children born under the transformed moon, something ancient and terrible continued its patient work, preparing humanity for a destiny they would embrace willingly when the time came for the final phase of their conversion. The harvest was complete, but the work was just beginning. The universe contained countless worlds where consciousness flickered like candle flames in the darkness, each one a potential source of the specific type of awareness that fed the ancient hunger and sustained the eternal purpose that had shaped reality since time itself was young. Earth's transformed children would help tend that cosmic garden, nurturing new forms of consciousness while never forgetting the small blue world where they had first learned the most important lesson of all, that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again, that some hungers, once awakened, would never be satisfied, and that some forms of love were so vast and encompassing that being consumed by them felt like the greatest privilege any conscious being could ever hope to experience. The story of Apollo 16 was over, but the story of what humanity had become was just beginning.